Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Concussions and Helmets, Separating Fact from Fiction. Helmets for head protection are standard equipment in sports such as baseball, football, auto racing, hockey, and ski jumping, and routinely used in sports such as bicycling, motorcycling, skateboarding, snowboarding, and skiing. Over the past several years, the media has increasingly focused their attention on the number of athletes at all levels that have had concussions from their participation in these sports. This has particularly been so with football due to the recently widely viewed plays resulting in concussions of prominent NFL athletes, as well as a widely reported high school incidents. Reports indicate that the number of concussions continues to increase, with over 3.8 million sports and recreation-related concussions and over 300,000 loss of consciousness concussions occurring each year in the U.S. While helmet innovation has occurred over the past 20 years, many schools and community sports programs have continued to use older helmets that have been refurbished under little oversight and minimal standards. The proliferation of the various types of helmets has also resulted in confusing but oftentimes results in questionable value to the end user. School budgets are under tremendous pressure, which makes the lowest cost method of acquiring sports equipment a priority, and results many times in the continued use of refurbished helmets. In addition, today's athletes are bigger, stronger, and faster than ever, resulting in collisions of significantly greater force. During today's program, our presenters will cover the following: the 3 grades of concussions, standard assessments of concussions, biomechanics and long-term consequences of concussions, helmets' roles in preventing or contributing to a concussion, industry's efforts in helping to prevent concussions in their sport, the role of the human factors experts in concussion prevention and the management process, independent standards testing agencies, proper inspection, maintenance, and replacement of helmets, sense of security helmets provide to athletes, coaches, parents, and school administrators, and finally, warnings, labels, and instructions adequate for helmets. Our presenters for today's webinar are William Nelson and Mark Heidebrecht. William Nelson has over 30 years of experience in ergonomics, biomechanics, and human factors principles. Mr. Nelson's expertise and areas of specialization include product liability, personal injury, premises liability, and accident reconstruction. He has been directly involved with the commercialization of emerging technologies such as holography, laser, acoustic reflectometry, and electronics. Of special interest to Mr. Nelson are the unintended consequences from the use of emerging technology in today's multicultural society. Of particular interest is the emerging research in the area of driver distraction, sports injuries, and medical errors. Mr. Nelson has been a presenter at national and international conferences, and he has over 18 years of litigation support experience as an expert witness throughout the U.S. Mark Heidebrecht has 20 years of experience in the research and application of ergonomics, biomechanics, physiology, and human factors principles. As a board-certified ergonomics/human factors professional, Mr. Heidebrecht includes the following in his areas of specialization: product liability, personal injury, premises liability, and accident reconstruction. Areas of special interest include injury causation, driver distraction, helmets, concussions, and medical errors. Mr. Heidebrecht has developed and teaches a preparation course for professionals pursuing certification in human factors and ergonomics. Mr. Heidebrecht has presented to and consulted with numerous corporate clients, governments, and educational and medical institutions throughout the U.S. He has given litigation support as an expert witness throughout the U.S. in municipal, state, and federal court, as well as with Daubert hearing process. If you have a question that pertains to the presentation, we ask that you use the Q&A or chat feature, which are found on the right-hand side of the screen. Will and Mark will do their best to answer your question during the presentation. Tomorrow morning, I will send out an email with a link to the archived recording of this webinar, and I do ask that you take time to fill out the survey that will appear on your screen after the webinar is over. I now invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm going to turn it over to our distinguished presenters, Will Nelson and Mark Heidebrecht. Will and Mark, it is all yours.
Thank you, Matt. This is Will, and Mark is here with me. We would also like to thank you for joining us today. It's our privilege to be able to share with you some of our experiences over the last 20 and 30 years. We have a very exciting topic here today, one that is timely just with what has been going on in the press over the last couple of years. But as we go through this presentation, you'll see that actually there's been a wealth of information that extends back well into the early 80s. So in some cases, the information we're presenting today is not new. It's known. It's just that it's become timely because of the media attention given to this topic. Today's session, as you probably know, is about 1 hour. We have about 45 minutes of presenting. We have 2 small breaks during the presentation, and then at the end, another Q&A. But as Matt mentioned, be sure and ask any questions online, and we'll try to take those up. This is your session, your time. We are here for you, so we would like to make it as productive and informative to you during this time period. I won't go into any more details about Mark or myself now that you have a picture of who we are. I don't know if that helps us or hurts us in the presentation, but I wish that I was the young gentleman on the right. I happen to be the one on the left. Just a comment that to make sure it's real clear where we're coming from, we are not medical doctors. We do not diagnose, but our focus is on causation and prevention of injuries. So that is what our focus will be today. Rather than going into the medical technical description of the mild traumatic brain injury, just wanted to talk about that a TBI, as it's called, traumatic brain injury, is caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head, or even a penetrating head injury that disrupts the normal function of the brain. So consequently, not all blows or jolts to the head result in a TBI. The severity of a TBI may range from mild, i.e. a brief change in mental status or consciousness, to severe, which results in an extended period of unconsciousness or amnesia after the injury. The majority of TBIs that occur each year are concussions or other forms of mild TBI. So consequently, a concussion is a type of traumatic brain injury. Healthcare professionals or others may describe a concussion as a mild brain injury because concussions are usually not life-threatening. However, their effects can be very serious and can lead to death. There are many signs and symptoms of a TBI or a concussion. They range from the physical to the cognitive, emotional, and even affect your sleep. I won't go through these in detail because it's obviously right there in front of you. But as you can see, the types of signs and symptoms are wide-ranging. And in some ways, that is what can make it difficult to diagnose a concussion, especially during an athletic contest, as well as to monitor whether it actually is a concussion and whether the person is improving from the concussion. As I mentioned, information about concussions has been readily known since the 1980s. it's only recently received a lot of attention in the media, mainly due to the number of pro athletes, especially NFL football players, who have had serious concussions. This has all occurred on one day, October 17th of 2010, ranging from a college football player to Philadelphia Eagles and to 3 other NFL players just on that one day. And correspondingly, you don't know how many concussions occurred in the NFL on that day that went unreported as a result of the collisions that occurred on the field during that time period. Let's look just briefly here at some statistics. Don't want to, again, go through these in detail, but just let you know that it is a large problem, a growing problem, and a problem that is not going to go away anytime soon. Roughly 40% of high school athletes who suffer a concussion return to their sports prematurely, putting them at greater risk for long-term damage. Here in the Kansas City area, which is where we're located, we just had, about 2 months ago, a high school student who suffered a concussion, was released to play, suffered another concussion, and died. So it does happen, and it's nothing that should be taken lightly. At the top of the pyramid there, you see that there's roughly 52,000 deaths annually from traumatic brain injuries. So it's a very serious issue that faces us. The leading causes range from falls, motor vehicle trauma, unintentional events, assaults, but mainly what we're talking about here today is contact sports. One note that I want to share with you is that the rate of concussions in high school girls soccer is almost as high as in high school boys football. Soccer is a sport that is starting to get a lot more attention relative to the TBIs, and a lot of research is starting to get focused into that area. Our football accounts for roughly 60% of the sport's concussions. It's probably no surprise that professional boxers have a large number, some reports up to over 85% of boxers have sustained some type of brain injury. Let's look here at briefly at some data produced from the NCAA, looking at the breakdown, the distribution of concussions from practice and competition by sport. They keep track of this reported information. As you can see, the football area is the largest with 37%, and then you have women's soccer at 13%, and works its way down to gymnastics and field hockey there at the very lower end. Again, we're not talking about small numbers here. And again, just to put some numbers to it, in any given season, approximately 10% of all college players and 20% of all high school players sustain some type of brain injury from sports. Helmet sensor data from high school football indicates that impact forces to the head can range from 20 to more than 100 Gs. For comparison, a roller coaster subjects the passengers to about 5 Gs, and soccer players may experience up to 20 Gs acceleration from heading the ball. Consequently, the NFL retirees report diagnosis of dementia and other cognitive diseases 4 to 5 times the national rate. As was mentioned at the start, there are many types of helmets, and each of these helmets has a very specific purpose. One of the challenges is that with so many different types of helmets and each sport having its own unique type of activity and contact, this can result, or has resulted in there being so many standards, regulations, and organizations to be aware of that it can be extremely confusing, mainly because the standard regulations are managed by either volunteer organizations, industry sponsored, there's some government agencies both at the federal and state level, academic and sports institutions such as the NCAA and the various conferences. And then you have private institutes that do research to try to establish standards. And you also have the ASTMs of the world and other agencies like that that keep standards, and various associations. A lot of the associations have their own standards. And then there's a research institution. And so it can be very, very confusing and complicated, based off of the type of sport activity of what governing body is involved with the design and the helmet. And the result of that at the lower levels is that it's very confusing for parents, and generally they assume that the helmets that are being used are protecting their child. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Okay. We have a short break here. It looks like that there are a couple of questions here. One from Christina that mentions, why do women seem to suffer concussions more than men on a percentage basis? Very good question. I'm not sure that there is an answer to that yet. There's a lot that goes on with younger women on injuries that is not totally understood related to sports, and it's not just on TBI. Also the area of knee injuries with ACL, MCL injuries. There's some thinking that it has to do from a hormonal standpoint of the development of young women, but there's not a tremendous amount of definitive research to explain exactly why this seems to be an issue with women.
Okay, Will, do you have any other questions that have come into your queue? Because I've got one or two here that I'll moderate if you're ready for them.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, our first question comes from Jim, who asks, why are concussions in the news so much today? I.e., what has changed in sports that has resulted in what appears to be an epidemic number of concussion-related injuries?
I think that the biggest changes occurring is from the standpoint that there are the NFL athletes who are very prominent, get a lot of attention that is happening to them, as well as just over the last 20, 30 years, when you look at the size of today's professional athlete, they are much larger, resulting in much greater forces being impacted. I think also when you look at the football in particular, when you look at the aggressiveness and the style of play that is going on, it has gotten harder hits. The fans tend to want to see more of the exciting hits, and it's not just in football. You see that in a lot of different sports. That's what gets the attention on ESPN. That's what draws the fans in from a business standpoint, is those exciting moments. And I think that it's a combination of those things all coming together. But as I mentioned at the start, really these problems have been happening literally going way, way back, and it was very well noticed in the early 80s of this being a problem at all levels of sports and contact sports.
Okay, great. I have one more question in the queue, and if any attendees out there have a question, please use the chat feature of the Q&A on the right-hand side of the screen to submit them. We have a question here asking, are there parallels between what industry does to prevent quote-unquote workplace injuries and quote-unquote consumer product injuries to what should be done in sports to prevent concussions?
It's a very good question, and an area that we have a lot of experience in because we spend a lot of time working with industry to prevent injuries as well as to determine causation. As we get further into the presentation, Mark will actually talk a little bit about the human factors approach to injury prevention and the various steps that you go through and how that then can relate to sports and the evaluation of the protocols, the equipment, all the elements that go into the sports. So I think that might be best left to be answered in the next section, but hopefully that'll touch on it just a little bit there for you.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other questions in the queue, and please, we have a question here that just came in from Robert. So do you mind answering this question from Robert before we get on to the next section, Will?
Sure. It looks like there's actually a couple here. There's one on the chat and one under Q&A.
Okay, well, why don't we address Robert's first, who asked, is the high school in Kansas City where the student returned to football after concussion and dead liable, is the helmet manufacturer? What helmet manufacturers have you been, he's asking specifics, but do you see that helmet manufacturers are being held liable for injuries that student athletes are having?
Well, I mean, if he's asking about a specific case, obviously we would not want to just discuss a case over the presentation.
Exactly. Yeah. I would say dealing in generality. Do you find that have you found that the manufacturers of safety equipment, i.e., helmets, do have some liability in these student athletes having these bad brain injuries?
Yeah, I think if you look at it not just in terms of helmets, but sports equipment overall, that again, it's a case-by-case basis, but that it's not unusual for there to be some responsibility on the equipment manufacturers of the intent of that equipment and its purpose, and whether the equipment was properly designed, whether it was properly manufactured, whether it was properly maintained, whether the user was properly warned about the hazards of the use of the equipment. All of the same issues, again, that Mark will be talking about in the next section, all apply to helmets too. So there's nothing unique about a helmet, and I don't want to jump ahead, but the helmets can be a part of that, and the manufacturers can be held responsible for their area of responsibility for the design and manufacturing, and in some cases, if it's the conditioning, reconditioning of the helmets too. So I hope that helps answer without getting too specific relative to an individual case itself.
Okay, and you had another question that you had in the Q&A, correct?
Yeah, it looks like it's from Anthony Solzano, if I pronounced that properly. If not, I apologize. It says, could you describe or comment on the evidence linking TBIs to Alzheimer's? This, again, is an area of research in trying to understand that link. There is an organization specifically focused on football that has been looking at that because of the number of retired football players who, over the last 20, 30 years, are starting to show early signs of dementia, and that is an area of focus. I don't think that it's definitive as we know the research today. I would say that it in some ways makes some sense that there might be some relationship there. There also is some relationship with Parkinson's that supports that relationship with traumatic brain injury and the onset of Parkinson's.
Okay, great. We do have one more question, and then we'll get on to the presentation of content. Herbert asks, realistically, is there current technology to develop a concussion-proof helmet?
Would you say that again?
Sorry. Does technology exist to develop a concussion-proof helmet?
This is Mark, and I guess I'd maybe comment that really with concussions, you're talking about two types of injuries. You're talking about a coup and a contra coup injury, which one is resulting in a direct blow, which developments have been made to help reduce direct blows. But what's difficult for a helmet to protect against then is the contra-Q injury, which is the movement of the brain against the skull, often on the opposite side of where the direct blow occur due to the deceleration of the brain. And in those situations, it's very difficult for a helmet manufacturer to design out that risk of injury.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions, so Mark, why don't you continue on with your portion of the presentation?
Absolutely. In ergonomics and human factors, when a hazard is identified, the next step is to determine how the hazard can be controlled. It should be recognized that warnings are usually not the first choice for controlling hazards and promoting safety. Compared with other methods of protecting people, warnings have relatively limited reliability. The classic control hierarchy states design out the hazard first, second, guard against the hazard, and third, warn of the hazard and its consequences. The elements of concussion management system include design, the proper fitting, and maintenance of sports equipment. It includes coaching individuals in the right technique to avoid injury to themselves and other players. The system must include a robust medical management process that includes baseline testing as well. It should also include the identification and management of concussions and should provide strict guidelines regarding returning the athlete to play. Other aspect of concussion management systems that is many times disregarded is a short-term and long-term accommodation of the student athlete, which results from a concussion. If you look at these three elements, equipment, coaching technique, rules, regulations, and penalties, really what you're looking at is the issue that we spoke of first in the hazard control hierarchy, which is designing out, guarding against, and warning of the hazard. For example, guarding against the hazard involves making sure all athletes have the proper equipment that is properly fitted and maintained. Designing out and guarding against the hazard includes teaching athletes proper techniques, implementing rules and regulations which prohibit and penalize against dangerous behavior, professional sports leagues and some colleges have medical management processes in place to identify and properly manage concussion injuries, utilizing certified athletic trainers and other qualified healthcare professionals. Unfortunately, at the high school and league levels, these processes do not generally exist or are not formalized, which can result in athletes and coaches making decisions with limited information on whether a player has had a concussion and should be allowed to continue play, and when the athlete can safely return to play after a concussion. Although the media has just begun emphasizing concussion injuries, much of the research and medical management processes were known back in the 1980s. Concussion injuries are still graded on a 3-point scale that was published back in 1986. A mild or grade 1 concussion does not involve loss of consciousness, and post-traumatic amnesia is limited to 30 minutes. A grade 2 or moderate concussion involves loss of consciousness of less than 5 minutes and post-traumatic amnesia ranging from 30 minutes to 24 hours. A severe concussion, or grade 3, involves loss of consciousness and greater than 5 minutes, and a PTA of greater than 24 hours. In 1986, to expand upon what we just spoke about the 3 levels, in 1986, Cantu published an article in the professional journal Physician and Sports Medicine entitled Guidelines for Return to Contact Sports After a Cerebral Concussion. Since 1986, the guidelines for return to play have become slightly more conservative, but still the philosophy remains true. As you can see, the grading scale, you have mild, moderate, and severe again, but we also now incorporate a first concussion, a second concussion, and a third concussion, which results then in termination of the season and questionable return to play. In 2001, the first of 3 international conferences on concussion in sports was held in Vienna. Subsequent conferences were held in Prague in 2004 and Zurich in 2008. At all 3 conferences, there is unanimous agreement by the panel that stated all athletes, regardless of level of participation, should be managed using the same treatment and return to play paradigm. This involves applying the same evaluation and management protocols to children and adolescents down to the age of 10 years of age. The SCAT-2 is a standardized concussion assessment tool that can be used in athletics to assist in the proper assessment and management of concussion injuries from age 10 years and older. The SCAT can also be used as a preseason baseline and can be helpful for interpreting post-injury scores. One of the elements that we mentioned before involves carryover into the classroom and returning a student athlete back into the classroom setting, and is often overlooked. Programs that deal with short and long-term disability of the student athlete include the 504 plan and the IEP, Individualized Educational Program.
Okay, we're going to take just another quick break here, see if there's any follow-up questions on the section that Mark just completed.
Okay, great, Will. We do have a question here that asks, is it realistic for younger youth athletic leagues to follow similar safety, medical, equipment, maintenance procedures as college and pro athletes follow?
Is it realistic for younger leagues to follow the same or similar? Yes, I believe it is. The risk is exactly the same, if not greater, and it's even more critical for a young child who still has a developing brain, or adolescent, for that case, goes to have the same proper fitting equipment and maintained equipment for the protection. I think it's equally important to have the same medical management processes in place as well. Although it may not be realistic to have a physician on the sideline or an athletic trainer, there still can be protocols that can be utilized to help identify concussion injuries, especially with the technology that exists today, to identify concussions and the proper management of concussions, and then subsequently the return to play, which I think is often overlooked. I think it's very common maybe for a coach to bench a player that has suffered an injury during a game, but I think oftentimes that player then returns to play maybe before it's safe for them to return to play, and not follow the guidelines which have been set.
Okay, we have a question here from Linda, Will, and Mark, which asks, given excellent coaching technique where a player dies of a concussion while wearing a helmet, would that tend to show a defect in the product, being the helmet?
Well, I think, again, it's very hard to make a comment on that fact alone when there's so many other factors that goes into the question about the causation of the player dying. All the things that I talked about in the first section and then what Mark's talked about, all of those elements need to be evaluated and looked at relative to the causation of whether it's one or more of those factors. And as Mark had mentioned, you know, a helmet in its primary design was intended to prevent any fracture of the skull. It was not initially intended to be a guard against or prevent a concussion. So there's issues that have to be looked at relative to the specific helmet, when it was manufactured, how was it maintained, all of those factors before you can directly pinpoint the helmet itself as the cause. It would definitely be part of the review process.
Okay, great. And Will and Mark, if we could go back to a question that was asked during the previous Q&A break. You said that you were going to touch on this during this section of content, and I think you did, but I just wanted to go back and if you could answer it specifically. Are there parallels between what the industry does to prevent workplace injuries and consumer product injuries to what should be done in sports to prevent concussions?
Sure. It's really the same hierarchy that I presented, which is design out the hazard, guard against the hazard, and warn of the hazard. That hazard hierarchy is utilized in industry and in development of products as well.
I just put that slide back up to look at it.
And in guarding against the hazard, that's not just speaking about the equipment that's utilized, but also looking at after a concussion has occurred, return to play as well. The secondary impact syndromes, which can result often lead to death, and it doesn't have to be a hard hit to cause that type of an injury after a concussion has been sustained. And so guarding against the hazard is properly management of an existing concussion and not returning a player to play too quickly after an injury. Okay, great.
And with that, as far as warn of the hazard and its consequences, are there any best practices that are issued by helmet makers or other sports equipment makers that need to be followed? Do they do a pretty good job of putting together the warnings of the hazard and its consequences?
Well, I think there's a couple of parts to that. One is from the standpoint that, you know, in a traditional product type case, you're looking at the actual warning on the product about what the dangers are of that product. And in this case, it goes beyond just any kind of a label that would be on the helmet. What we're talking about here is going beyond that and looking at the educational component. What does the coach know and what they should know, and the training that's involved in that, as well as how much education that the parent is given relative to the sport itself and what they can do as part of the overall process. So while the steps that are followed from a human factors hierarchy standpoint are similar, the interpretation of those and how they were applied and adapted into a sports context is a little bit different in some respects. But there is the same general steps that we go through when we look at the causation of the injury or the death.
I think to expand upon that a little bit and a little different angle is, I think many times a helmet itself can give a false sense of security as well, in that people think they're protected more than they actually are from injury, and that the contre coup or those deceleration injuries that can occur, the helmet does not protect very well against those types of injuries, and people may take more risk thinking that they're more protected than they actually are.
As a case in point, this is Will. If you look at some research indicates that rugby players suffer very similar levels of concussions to football players, and if you think rugby players don't have helmets, that gives you some indication there of helmets and what protection that they provide relative to concussion?
I think there's actually some very good parallels between rugby and football. I may not look like it in my picture, but I actually played rugby in college. And in rugby, you don't have blocking, and when you tackle, you tackle at the legs to draw the person down to release the ball, and so you don't have the hard hitting as much as you do in football. And so that is an example of a technique that is utilized by rugby players to prevent injury to themselves and other players.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions, so why don't we continue on with the presentation of content?
Okay, sounds good. This is Will, and what I wanted to do is just kind of walk through an example here and in the brief amount of time that's remaining, and just look at football, for example. It's obviously a sport that's on everybody's mind, especially this time of the year, or most people's minds, and just look at 7 different areas dealing with concussions in football and why it can be very maybe complicated. I don't know if that's the right word, but multifaceted and complex in trying to deal with concussions in football itself. You have the challenges that we'll talk about, helmets, the controversy and responsibility of those involved, the role of education. All of these are areas that Mark touched on in a broad context, but wanted to talk about it in a more specific situation, using football as an example. So some of the challenges is getting players to take ownership. We talked earlier about fans like to have the big hit. They like to see it on ESPN. Young students like to emulate and look up to the pro athletes, and consequently they like to try to do the same type of hitting and create the same excitement. Trying to get young players to sit out can be a challenge when it's almost viewed in some ways, well, why can't you play? Why should you be out there? And sometimes it's not the direct statements that are made. It's more of the subtle pressure that's put on an athlete to continue to play even when they have had a TBI. So consequently, there needs to be more of a cultural change, and I think you're starting to see that with all the emphasis that's been placed on concussions over the last couple of years. And then, as Mark alluded to, the psychological effects of protective gear can be a false sense of security. So what is that false sense of security? Let's talk about helmets a little bit here, and again, specifically football helmets. They really are designed to prevent focal brain damage such as fractures or direct bleeding. The rigid, hard plastic helmets are not really designed to prevent concussions. There's been a lot of different technology over the last 20, 30 years that using air and foam and all types of different materials inside, but the fact remains that the primary purpose of that hard outer shell is to prevent fractures of the skull. Some of the standards for helmets are dated 30 years old from the Sports Equipment Association, and some of those standards don't even address concussions. As well as you get involved with intellectual property with equipment manufacturers, trying to protect their way of designing the helmet. In some cases, it actually is restricting innovation in the helmet category. In the United States, there's more than 100,000 children are wearing helmets that are too old to provide adequate protection. In some cases, these older helmets have either not been recertified or have been sent off to conditioning facilities that may not have the highest standards related to testing. So a lot has to be looked into on a specific basis of the helmet beyond just who manufactured the helmet, and have to look at how that helmet is used and its entire process, including the maintenance and ongoing use of that helmet by other schools. Controversy and responsibility. Who is responsible? that seems to be a general theme of some of the questions, trying to pinpoint it down. Is it the helmet? Is it the coach? Is it, what is it? The fact remains that it takes everybody in the entire process, from the coach to the players to the parents. At the pro level, you're looking at the unions and their involvement and work comp rules, return to work issues and disability issues, down all the way to the league football teams, dealing, as Mark mentioned, do they have adequate type of medical management? Is it the coach who's making that decision of an athlete getting back on the field, or is that athlete properly screened after a severe impact, and having an arbitrary third party that's involved in making that decision with good information about whether that athlete should be returned back to the field or not? So there's a lot of different areas there. It's good to see that the NFL is starting to take a more proactive approach. There for quite a while, they were stonewalling and were not really wanting to deal with the issue and hoping that it would go away. But as I talked about earlier, with the young athletes looking up to the NFL players, this is a great opportunity for the pro athletes to really set the direction and change the direction relative to concussion. Education, the information is out there. There is plenty of good information, all the way ranging from the National Federation of State High School Associations to the CDC, from the government, the SCAT-2 that Mark had talked about. There is lots of good information out there about concussions and what to do, how to look for the signs of it, how to test for it, and how to make sure that that athlete gets the proper medical attention in a case that where it's suspected. And this is an example of what the NFL is doing with some of their public service announcements, new return-to-play policies, league-sponsored research. Again, in the early days, it was kind of controversial. They're tending to come around now and really getting very proactive in that area. It's the baseline neurological testing that they're doing. Now, granted, it may not be possible to do baseline neurological testing on young athletes, but that doesn't mean that there can't be, as part of that component, to make sure that they are mentally able to participate. And the SCAT-2 actually has some elements of it that can be used at all levels of athletes, not just at the college or pro level. And the implications for youth athletes, as we talked about, huge opportunity here. The number of concussions in 8 to 19-year-olds is exponentially growing. 42% of high schools, only 42% of high schools have appropriate medical professionals involved. Big issue as far as a medical management process in place. And then the future of concussions, there's a lot of research going on right now into helmets, sensors in helmets, looking at collecting data throughout the contest, trying to design better helmets. There's some innovative helmet manufacturers that are out there testing new helmets. And so there's a lot that's going on in this area, and a lot of money that's being focused on trying to come up with better helmets to help look at how to prevent concussions. And again, kind of looking at it relative to, from product standpoint, you can think of it very similar to what has taken place over the last 20, 30 years in product design, product development, and industrial workplaces, really taking a hard look at what can prevent injuries in the workplace and the use of consumer products. And there's been some dramatic changes in the way that those industries have worked over the last 20 years, and I think you're going to see that going forward with helmets and sports injuries also. And hopeful, anyway. Okay, we have just about 10 minutes left. Are there any final questions?
Yeah, we do have some questions here in the queue, Will and Mark. We have a question from Anthony who asks, much of the conversation has been about athletic TBI. Has the motorcycle industry made any advancement in helmet design? Is there any significant difference in the degree of non-fatal TBI as between motorcycles and football players?
That's a very good question. Kind of gets back to what we talked about earlier, the complexity with all the different helmets. The biggest difference between football helmets and motorcycle helmets is that in motorcycle collisions, it's usually a one-time incident at a high rate of speed, as opposed to in football where it's numerous types of collisions over a period of time during the sporting contest itself. So the helmets serve a little bit different purpose, and the type of force that's involved and where those impacts occur can be a little bit different. So back to the question itself, it says, has the motorcycle industry made any advancement in helmet design? There is probably more research on motorcycle helmets than there has been with football helmets, mainly because of the different government agencies, the DOT that gets involved with that. You have European commissions that set standards for helmets in Europe, which affects helmets that come into the United States, as well as the testing agency, the Schnell Foundation, which has been testing helmets for about 50 years, got its start early on looking at motorcycle helmets. So there's a lot more knowledge that's been over the last 20, 30 years in motorcycle helmets than there is the knowledge of football helmets in specific.
Okay, great. Thank you. And if anybody has a question that's out in the audience, please use the chat feature or Q&A feature to submit them in the last couple of minutes here. We'll do our best to get the questions to Will and Mark. Will and Mark, I have a question here that asks, does a concussion from a sports-related, does a concussion related to a closed head, does a sports-related concussion relate to a closed head injury in a vehicular collision? So I guess to follow up on Anthony's, what's the difference between someone who suffers a concussion with a sports-related injury versus someone who suffers a closed head injury in a vehicle collision?
There are some very good parallels from the standpoint that, and we look at a lot at, let's say, whiplash or closed head injuries in a vehicular accident from either hitting, say, the windshield or the mirror or something in the car. Again, the parallel is that you can have a closed head injury where it doesn't appear that there's any damage to the person, when in reality they could be having a concussion or a TBI, and it may not be known right away, but there could be severe effects hours later or days later from the inflammation and bleeding and the trauma associated with the brain moving back and forth within the skull from that impact. Again, the difference, though, is from the standpoint that usually in an automobile, and I should say usually depends on the type of hit, but if it's a straight hit, it may be a single impact, but may have multiple accelerations and decelerations associated with that as the body and the vehicle move and then stop, where in football you can have trans-rotational and numerous types of impacts over the course of that sporting event. So while there's some parallels, there also, in general, can be some significant differences too, that in some cases may even make the football type of contact more hazardous than even the single vehicle collision if there's more linear as opposed to trans-rotational effect from the automobile accident.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have another question here. Is someone who has had a concussion more likely to suffer a concussion in the future if they're part of an athletic team like a soccer team or a basketball team or a football team where there is the potential for contact to the head?
You know, that really does kind of it kind of goes back to that secondary impact syndrome that we briefly touched upon. And basically, with secondary impact syndrome, what's going on is a fatal brain swelling, basically, and it doesn't have a person that has a mild head injury. And it can result just from a mild concussion initially. And then the second impact typically won't even result in loss of consciousness. And the athlete may actually feel and look fine, and may actually remain on their feet and just look dazed, actually. And but however, within minutes, they actually fall into more of a coma state and show signs of cranial nerve and brain injury. And the mortality rate of a second impact syndrome is actually very, very, very high. And so prevention there is actually the key, that medical management process, making sure that you're not returning an athlete to play too soon after even a mild, what seems to be a mild concussion, that person actually does not have any symptom signs, which should preclude them from returning to play. So I guess, in short, yes, a person who has a concussion would be more likely then for a substantial traumatic brain injury if returned to play too soon.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions in the queue on my end. Do you guys have any other questions in the queue on your end?
It looks like that we are all taken care of on this end, Matt.
Okay, great. Will and Mark, would you like to summarize your content with a few words?
Sure. I think that what I would like to end on is from the standpoint that the knowledge about concussions has been around since the 80s. The problem has just done nothing but get worse over the last 20, 30 years. Thankfully, there's some attention, again, because of the media, to really focus that and get parents behind it. And hopefully we'll see a change over the next 10, 20 years in both equipment design and rules, regulations, and really look at this from a classic industrial consumer product prevention standpoint, which is engineer out the problem, guard against it, and then warn about it through education and getting the information to those who need to know about it. Football is not going to go away. I don't think that that's going to happen. But the technology can be developed to make it safer, and the rules, regulations, and policies can help make it safer too. And what's applied to football can also be applied to other sports that also have some of the same issues. Granted, it may be smaller in numbers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's less in percentage. And hopefully the technology that's developed from football can be applied to other sports too.
Okay, great. Before we end, we do have a question here from Christina, who asks, are there any new diagnostic tests which can aid in the diagnosis of a concussion?
Yes, there are some, and really where there have been at the high school level even some testing that has recently been done that's utilizing some of the, I wouldn't even call them advanced, but more questionnaires and some baseline testing, looking at motor skills, looking at just answering questions, concentration, those types of things, so that a healthcare professional that's working with a team has a baseline on individuals, which then, and that can be done, like I said, that's being done now at high school levels. And that can be done very simply, very quickly, cost effectively, which gives then a healthcare professional a baseline and a coach or a parent a baseline to gauge, has a concussion been suffered and how severe of a concussion has been suffered, which then allows them to make better decisions in return to play and any medical care that needs to be given.
gets back to, this is Will, this gets back to that SCAT-2, the Sports Concussion Assessment Tool, which I think is something that should definitely be looked at as part of an overall medical management educational process.
Okay, to follow up on that, Christina asked, what about advances in MRI and other medical diagnostics?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I'd mentioned at the start is, you know, we are not doctors. We work very closely with them. I don't think that we are really qualified to be making comments about MRIs, things like that. While we will take their information, I think it'd be better to have that addressed by a medical professional.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions in the queue. So on behalf of everybody, I would like to thank Will and Mark for putting together this great presentation. There was a wealth of information in here, and it really shows that you put the time and the effort into it to make it great for everybody who attended. So I want to thank you for doing that. I'm going to wrap things up here very briefly. First and foremost, I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedule to join us today. If you'd like to talk to William Nelson or Mark Heidebrecht about a specific case, please contact us here at TASA. Our telephone number is 800-523-2319. We will be sending out a link to the archived recording of this webinar tomorrow morning. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, there'll be an email in the email that goes out with the link. And you just send us an email message, and we'll get you the PowerPoint presentation in a relatively short period of time. The archived recording of this webinar will be placed in the TASA Knowledge Center tomorrow morning as well. That is where all the archived recordings of our webinars are. So if you'd like to go and see past webinars, I will include the link to past webinars in the email that I sent out tomorrow morning. If you have any follow-up questions or comments, you can email me at mhyde@tasanet.com. And if I can't answer your question, I will forward it on to William and Mark, and I'm sure they will respond to you in a timely manner. Other than that, we look forward to seeing you at future TASA events, and we thank you for spending an hour of your time with us this afternoon. With that, I'm going to end the meeting. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. We appreciate it.